welcome to BBDD. Today this video is about DMPCs. So this is the technique of running a game as DM and also playing a full player character within that game. And this is basically the way that I run pretty much all of my games. However, if you watch YouTube videos from other YouTube DMs, quite a few of them will warn you against ever doing this. And now that I've run more games and I've learned a bit more, I've started to realise the wisdom in a lot of that advice. However, I do still do this myself, and I find it a quite useful technique for many reasons. So this video will basically be a short 6-item on each side pros and cons list, basically talking through the ways that this can help you as a DM and the drawbacks that it will introduce to your game and the limitations it has. I think it's quite a useful technique. I think it's one that you shouldn't shy away from, just because some people might say, oh, don't ever do this. But I do warn you to be aware of the drawbacks it can introduce. So let's jump into the pros and cons list. So starting with the pros, the main thing on the top of the list is it allows for subtle DM control. So basically, when you're a DM, you're running the world, obviously, you're setting up all the events and the situations, and you're prepared for a certain amount of things to happen, but you've left some leeway for the players to decide whatever they want to do and all the weirdness that players introduce to the table. But there will be a sort of structure you want to follow along. But it kind of sucks to just like invisible wall your players into certain things or railroad them into certain things, even though you do want them to go in a certain direction. You want to do it in a subtle way, and having a full player character that you're running in the adventure gives you a way to translate the word of the DM into something much more integrated into the game world. So your character can have limited knowledge, and they can suggest things or outright say things that if they were to come from you as the DM, then the players would interpret in a very different way, in a very kind of, they would think, oh, well, that's the DM suggesting something, or the DM wants us to do something. But if it's coming from your DMPC, then they're more likely to overlook it, or you can subtly guide them in certain ways, or possibly you can outright lie to them and distract them in certain ways and add more drama and offence. So it allows for really subtle and interesting DM control. That's one of the major points. The second one is, basically, as a DM, you don't get to play Dungeons & Dragons all that much. And playing Dungeons & Dragons is a lot of fun. DMing is a lot of fun. It can become a complete obsession, and you'll find that you're not really playing characters all that much anymore. You're just thinking about building worlds, building stories, building engaging NPCs and all that. And you will then miss out on the details and the technicalities of running players in games. And I think having more in-depth knowledge of how certain classes work, how certain races and class combinations work, really will help you to develop your games and the games that you run. So being able to play more and play more varied classes is very useful. I personally I've played maybe half the player classes available in the player's handbook, and then there's all the extra homebrew ones that I'd love to have a shot of. But if you're constantly just DMing, then you're not getting the opportunity to actually explore the player characters as well. And it's quite a nice way that if you're able to run a DMPC within one of your games, you can then also have a chance to kind of explore different skill sets and different tools in that way. The third point is, you're basically going to be doing this anyway. So this basically touches on the fact that pretty much every game that I've been a player in, at one point or another, the party will absorb an NPC from the DM and add them to the party. They're either going to be a guide or some kind of traitor, or even just somebody who acts like a full player character, and the DM is going to have to be constantly thinking about, oh, what's this person doing? It's happened in pretty much all of the games that I've been in. There have been persistent NPCs that the DM has introduced, possibly imagining they'd only be short-term characters, and then the party has globbed them in, or maybe the DM is using them as a narrative device to guide the story or to give tension between the characters. And so this is going to happen anyway. You're going to have the skills to run a fairly complex character, NPC, or player character within the party anyway, so it may as well just be a player character, because the player character sheet then gives you a lot more options to play with, a lot more details. You're not just dealing with a monster stat block, you're dealing with something a lot more complex. So it is a thing that is going to happen one way or another, so it's, you know, you may as well get the benefits of playing a full character. We go to the fourth thing, which is brain training. Basically, in order to do this, I've had to figure out ways to separate my mind in several games. So obviously you've got your DM mind, which is running the game and trying to figure out where the story's going, trying to control information flow, trying to make sure that the calculations are running fine, but also making sure the pacing and the narrative is running fine. And if you add on top of that trying to run a player character at the same time and trying to separate the motivations that the player character has from the motivations that the DM has, so that you can even surprise yourself in a way, or act with ignorance in your player character self, even though you are also God at the same time in the DM, that really requires quite a significant amount of brain power and a amount of flexibility in your mind, which I think is just useful. It's a useful skill to develop, it's a useful skill to get better at. Obviously I'm not saying I'm great at it, I make mistakes. As you'll see from the cons list, the player character can sometimes fade into the background, but the more you do it, the more your mind gets used to it, and if you get into a real flow in your game, then you'll find you're kind of adventuring at the same time. You're enjoying, say, particularly if you're running a module with a DMPC, you can be enjoying the tricks and traps of the module whilst also having the module right there and reading it and guiding the other player characters through. So I think it's a really useful mental training technique and will make your mind a lot sharper. It'll demand more evocative acting because you have to separate your player character DMPC from the DM voice. It also, for the fifth point, it slows down the game. Now this particular pro will appear on the cons list as well, because depending on the game you're running, maybe you don't want it to be slow, and it also slows down combat. We'll get to that in the cons list. For the positive side, it will slow down the way you play, because simply if you have a full DMPC within your game, it's very easy to just ignore that player character and to just ignore its motivations, its personality, and just move on with the story. Because as a DM, you want to build the narrative, you want the narrative to have a good pace. But the more you get used to it, you might want to have moments where your DMPC will express themselves, will talk a bit, will discuss something with the other players. And if you actually force yourself to make time for this, it forces you to think about the game in a different way. It allows you to stop just kind of pushing the narrative on and on and on and keeping the pacing, and actually give some time for discussion and for those nice little downtime moments that you sometimes get in Dungeons and Dragons. And particularly if you are having to set aside being a dungeon master to fully engage with one of these, then you're not just sitting there whilst the other players are having this little downtime moment and thinking, okay, I want to get onto my next event, or okay, when am I going to hit with them with an ambush, or when is this going to kick off? You're actually involved with the discussion yourself, and so you can have a nice half an hour, 40-minute just chat and chill time with your players as a player with them, and really get into the world and build the world in subtle ways. And I think that slows down the game in a really positive way. But we'll get on to how it also slows down the game in a negative way in the cons list. And the final thing is it kind of linked to the fourth pro, which is it forces you to be creative. You will have to really think about which actions apply to what. So as a DM, you're trying to build this world and you're trying to make it cohesive and engaging, and then as a player you're trying to explore this world. You're trying to push its limits in a lot of ways. Players tend to butt up against the edges of what the DM allows possible, and to look for creative ways around. Like personally, as a DM, I like to build events. I like to have problems for the players to figure out, but I don't like to specify just one solution. I'll maybe have 2 or 3 solutions that I've thought out, but I'll leave it flexible enough that I know that a good player could use something in their equipment or use a particular spell or ability that might surprise me. And if I'm also a DMPC at the same time, then that allows me to engage with my own problems, my own inventions from a completely different angle. So it allows you to think about things from multiple different directions, and it really does force you to be much more creative in the way you tell your story, the way you construct your story, and the way you play your characters. Because when you're not fully engaged with that player character as your only job, when you're DMing at the same time, you can't put the same level of detail in as a player character alone can do for that character. So it means you have to be quite creative in the way you express that particular character's personality, their motivations, and the way they play their part within the game. So I think it does force you to be creative in a really positive way. Okay, so that finishes off the pros list. Next we'll move on to the cons, and then you'll have as much information as I have, and you can decide where you fall on the pros or the cons on this particular technique. So, 6 items like last time. First thing is, you can't focus on the PC skills. As anybody who's played a player character in Dungeons and Dragons knows, the player character sheet is pretty damn complicated, depending on the class. Well, certainly if you're a magic user, it's really complicated, but even just any usual class, it's pretty engaging and it's pretty full on knowing everything that's going on in your character sheet. Abilities, just on their own, take a lot of thinking about, a lot of creative ways you can use them and apply them into the game. And on top of that, you've got all your equipment, all your items. It's a lot to hold in your mind. And if you're DMing at the same time as running a player character, you will definitely lose track of what's going on in your inventory, of what spells you've got. For myself, I found it quite useful to have like the spell cards that you can buy from Forgotten Realms, so that I could have all the spells that I knew my character had and had ready, and I could just look down at them and think, okay, well I could cast that now. And on top of that, I always use mostly I use digital character sheets, so I'll just have a PDF open in another window ready to jump over to there to have a quick check of their character sheet. But even so, if you're running a game at the same time and you're trying to make engaging NPCs and engaging story, you're going to lose track of your own player character skills and abilities and equipment. It's an unavoidable downside, really. Second point is, it is going to slow down the game. Now, this is on the pros list as well, but particularly when it comes to combat, you're going to slow down the game when you've got a DMPC. Because if you imagine you've got, let's say, just one other player character in the game, and they get into a fight with 5 monsters. So there is 5 monsters, a DMPC, and the player character. If the initiative rolls out in a lopsided way, it could be 6 entire combat turns before the player character gets a shot. And this can be pretty slow and pretty boring for the player characters. There are ways you can get around this. You could mix up the initiative slightly, so if it's a big chunk of monsters and then the DMPC, you could space it out. You could have a couple of monsters have a go, then give the player character a go, and then a couple more monsters and the player character. This might change how effective they are, but some of that live noodling around with the numbers can be useful sometimes. Other games that I've played in, the DM has had little monster sheets that he's then handed to the player characters to run the DMPCs, or they were more like complex NPCs that were with the party to run. So he allows other players to run his players, but only within combat. Outside of combat, for the narrative and for the story, he will act them out and play them, but within combat he allows the players to do it because it is more engaging for the players to have something to do rather than just sitting watching you rolling various dice. So there are ways around it, but it will definitely slow down the game. This can be a positive, as you can see from the pros list, but do be careful of how you balance it and how many DMPCs you're running, and just the way initiative's going to roll out, particularly in combat. The third point is a pretty big one as well. So the DMPC can vanish into the background. It's so easy to get stuck into the narrative pace, to the necessity of running the adventure and making it seem snappy and punchy and making sure that it keeps going on. And when you're focusing on that and you also have a DMPC in the game, you will find that you just ignore that DMPC. They will just kind of fade into a background, become very NPC-like, and they don't really have an opinion, they don't have much of a personality, and it can become like you'll get through certain parts of the adventure and then you think, oh yeah, we have that guy in the party, don't we? And that's when you know you need to change your pacing a little bit and really focus on that DMPC. Give them some space to move, give them some space to act, and give them a personality. You need to think about them, perhaps not as complex as a full PC, but you do need to give them some motivations and some backstory, and make sure that you're adding just a little bit every now and again to push that character to the fore, to give them some kind of edge that will make them memorable. So it's like making an NPC basically, but slightly more complex and more ongoing. And on to the fourth point, which is very linked to the second: boring combat. So as I said before, this makes combat quite slow, and you do need to address that. You need to either make it... Dealing with this one is tricky, actually. Depending on the game you're running, the combat can be quite dull. Just simply because combat takes a long time, and if there's only one other player character, they're just going to get that one go, and then they're kind of stuck. You could give them NPCs to run in the game as well. So, like for example, one game I'm running, the player character has a pet wolf. You could give them control over that NPC so that it's not just all on you doing the choices, they actually have things that they can play too. It could actually even come along as a benefit as they level up and improve their skills. They then suddenly gain control over this additional thing. Or you could give them control, as I said previously, you could give them control over the DMPC, but only during combat, and then they have something else to play around with, and it takes some weight off you and you can just run the monsters more effectively. But you do need to address the slowdown of the pace of the game. The fifth point is it does not work with any more than 2 PCs. So this is something I only recently discovered, because most of the games that I've run have been only 1 to 2 other players. I've been able to get away with having a DMPC or 2 DMPCs within the game, so that I can kind of flesh out the party and run the game more effectively. And at about that level, when you've got 2 other humans at the table, you can pretty much run the game and run your DMPCs without too much slowdown, without bogging the situation down too much. But you add just 1 more other player, as I recently discovered, when you have 3 live humans at the table and you are then trying to run the game, give them space to play and give space for your DMPC, I just don't think it's going to work. Maybe you can get to the level where you'll make it work, but all of the problems get multiplied much more at that point. So that DMPC is going to fade way into the background, the slowdown is going to be way more, everything just gets so much harder to balance that I think you're much better off running this with either 1 other human at the table or 2 other humans maximum. Any more than that and you really are asking for trouble, and you're better off just running NPCs and monsters and not having a DMPC in the game. And the last point is it will demand acting skills. So not every DM is into doing voices, into role-playing. I've played in several different games and both systems work. I personally enjoy acting, I enjoy doing voices, I enjoy really inhabiting the characters and trying to make them quite dramatic. But I know there are other games that I've played in where the DM doesn't enjoy that at all, or doesn't really put that as a focus, and that's perfectly fine. I enjoy both ways of playing, there is not a problem either way. But if you're running a DMPC and you're trying to DM, you do have to differentiate that DMPC quite dramatically from either your other NPCs or from your DM voice. So you really want to be able to give it a unique accent, unique mannerisms that will allow the player characters to quickly, without you really having to say it, to understand that, oh right, that is the DMPC speaking now, that is not the DM speaking, that is not some NPC speaking. So it does demand that you become quite flexible with your acting, quite vocal, quite expressive, so that you will improve the understanding of your players. And if you're not into that, then it might be asking quite a bit. But that about it does it for the pros and cons list. I hope this video is useful. As I say, personally, I run most of my games with 1 to 2 players, like human players, and I will often have 1 or often 2 DMPCs. And the reason I do this is because that's the way I learned how to play Dungeons and Dragons. And also, as I've gotten better at it, I've discovered it's quite a useful storytelling tool. Because if you have 1 DMPC, then you can, and 1 other player character, then you can adventure together. So I often play Dungeons and Dragons with my girlfriend, and we can kind of explore a story together. It's not just me telling a story to her, it's more the pair of us exploring this world together and having just a fun evening together telling a story. If you have more than 1 other player, then you can use your DMPCs, often 2. You design them intentionally. So I'll design 1 very moral, upstanding, good PC, or DMPC rather, and 1 much more morally ambiguous, sneakier DMPC. The good one can be the focused healer. You could have a druid or a cleric, or simply just a fighter, so that you've got somebody to absorb damage and to take potentially fatal attacks that you may be a bit worried to give to player characters, while the morally ambiguous one can add a little bit of tension in, can maybe do the more negative things that the player characters don't want to do. They can also be more like the lock picker or the trap finder. So you can kind of use your DMPCs as toolboxes to help you manage the party. So if you know that you've got a small party and they maybe only have very limited skill sets and they're going to struggle with the broad requirements within the game, then you can pop in a couple of DMPCs that you know are going to slightly broaden the playing field, give them a bit more to play around with, and make the moments a bit more dramatic, a bit more complex at the same time. Particularly if you have a predominantly good party but you have 1 neutral or lawful evil DMPC, then they can add all sorts of interesting tension, all sorts of interesting moments into the story that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise, because if you're all just mono lawful good or up in the good area, you're all going to address problems in a very similar way. So personally, I find it a really useful technique. I still use it today. I have more recently become aware of why it can be a problem, as the cons list shows, and I would be quite intrigued to run more games where I'm simply DMing, so that I can actually focus much more on the story and to be able to express the story in a more distant way than I usually do. So the points that touch on the game's speed, when you're running a DMPC, the pacing has to change to be slightly more intense, and the story has to be slightly more kind of moment to moment, whereas I think if I was just running it as a DM, the story itself would take on the focus rather than the characters. I mean, obviously the player characters would be an important focus as well, but rather than really mining into the details of the characters that I'm playing, I'd probably do slightly broader strokes. But anyway, it would be an interesting thing to see, and that pretty much concludes the list. So hopefully that's been useful. As I say, I don't fall really hard on either side. I think both have benefits, both have drawbacks, and it's up to you what you use in your game, but that's the way I run mine. I hope you enjoyed the video, and good luck, and be well.